In today's video, I'm gonna show you the differences in between having 1x32GB, 2x16GB, and 4x8GB RAM. But I'll also tell you why the difference in performance may happen. First thing we need to consider is single channel versus dual channel versus quad channel. The more RAM channels you have, the better the performance should be. But how does it work? Maybe not exactly as you think. Technically, when you're using only one RAM stick, you will be limited to single channel, which means you'll have half the bandwidth you would have with two RAM sticks, dual channel, and 1/4 of the bandwidth you would have with four RAM sticks, quad channel. By this logic, it would be better to always have 4 sticks of RAM, right? Well, not really, because there are some variables. First of all, the number of RAM sticks aren't always connected to the number of memory channels because the CPU has to support those same memory channels. The current mainstream CPUs from AMD and Intel, like the Ryzen 7000 series and the Core i14 series, well, they only support dual channel, meaning that even if you use 4 RAM sticks with those CPUs, you'll still be limited to dual channel. You'll just have 2 RAM sticks per channel. The only CPUs that support quad channel are the HEDT ones, like the Intel Xeons and AMD Threadrippers, with the AMD EPYC and higher-end Xeons supporting octet channel. On top of this, the DDR5 changed things a bit, and you might read online or hear someone saying that every single stick of DDR5 is now dual channel. And they're right, but also wrong. With DDR5, the design was changed in several ways, and now each memory stick delivers in fact dual channel, but it is dual channel on the RAM side. Let me explain. Current mainstream CPUs feature 128-bit bus, and when those 128-bit bus are being used, they're working in dual channel, while single channel will be using 64-bit bus. And while the DDR5 design was changed for each stick to deliver dual channel, to be kind of more efficient, they just broke one 64-bit bus channel into two 32-bit bus ones, meaning that technically, if you're using one DDR5 memory stick, you can say you're using dual channel on the memory side, but only single channel on the CPU one, as you're still using half of the CPU's available bandwidth, in this case 64-bit. In a matter of fact, if you compare both DDR4 and DDR5 in CPU-Z, with both using 2 sticks of RAM, well, DDR4 will show you 2x 64-bit, while DDR5 will show you 4x 32-bit, so both are using 128-bit bus, dual channel. And that begs the question, if 4 RAM sticks are still dual channel for most systems, what's the point of having 4 RAM sticks besides capacity? Well, this leads to the second thing we need to consider, single rank versus dual rank. The rank is applied for each RAM stick individually, and with DDR5 the number of banks per memory stick doubled. And as I stated before, we now have dual channel of 32-bit bus for each stick, so single and dual rank differences should be less relevant now at least. But in theory, dual rank 4 RAM sticks or two 32GB sticks will always be faster than single rank at the same frequency and timings. And in case you're thinking about it, usually single RAM sticks have memory chips on one side only, while the dual rank ones have memory chips on both sides. And the performance difference usually comes from bank interleaving. Just stating that. And as I stated before, most DDR5 32GB sticks have memory chips on both sides, so most of them are dual rank, while the 16GB sticks are usually single rank, and since all DDR5 ICs are like 16GB nowadays, I believe, the 8GB sticks are kind of half rank, which is acceptable but not optimal. And I could tell you a bit more, but I guess I'll just leave it to the end of the video. And well guys, it is a very good day, so I decided to record outside because why not? The sound might be a little off, well, comparing to the other sound that you hear across the video, because since I'm recording outside the microphone is different as well. and so on, so on, so on. Today's video is a remake of the video that I made in 2022, 1x16GB versus 2x8GB versus 4x4GB, but now since it is 2024 and DDR5 is kind of mainstream, I remade the video to feature 1x32GB versus 2x16GB versus 4x8GB, this on a Ryzen system. And if you're thinking about performance differences, don't, because all the configurations, the three configurations that you have here are running at the same frequency and same timings, manually tweaked timings, and even some main sub-timings that may affect the performance. They were all tweaked manually. I'm even stuttering. They were all tweaked manually in order to ensure that the frequency and timings are exactly the same, for the differences to be only in between single channel, dual channel, single rank and dual rank, and so on. But we'll talk more about that in the final thoughts. So let's go to the benchmarks. But before, today's video sponsor is GVG More, bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. Starting with the productivity benchmarks, we have Photoshop 2024, where RAM does effectively matter, with the 2x16GB being 6% faster than the 1x32GB, and with the 4x8GB configuration putting another 3% on top of that, which is not bad. Premiere 2024 is more or less the same, with the 2x16GB still being 6% faster than the 1x32GB configuration, but now the 4x8GB configuration only puts 2% on top of that, which is a bit less than with Photoshop. And in Blender measuring in samples per minute, we have all the results within the margin of error, honestly, so with the 2x16GB being the one to perform the best after calculating the average of the 3 runs. But still, all inside the margin of error. I'm even stuttering. And to finalize the productivity benchmarks, we have PCMARK 10, that includes a huge amount of workloads mixed up in one test, from productivity, office workloads and GPS workloads as well, to disk storage benchmarks and so on. And by the way, I want to thank UL Benchmarks for sending me the serial key to this benchmark. And in here we have the first order results, where the 1x32GB and 2x16GB configurations deliver results inside the margin of error, but the 4x8GB one delivers quite less. And it seems that happened after some runs, which is honestly quite odd, but it is what it is, I guess. Let's now jump to the gaming benchmarks. Starting with the Assetto Corsa, we have a CPU bottleneck at both 1080p and 1440p, which is actually good for RAM testing, and even there we saw the 1 and 2 sticks configurations performing basically the same, with the 4x8GB being slightly faster at all resolutions, even in a GPU bound scenario as 4K here, which is actually interesting to see. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is also a messed up scenario somehow, as the 2x16GB configuration seemed to have some kind of bug, as it performed slightly worse than the single stick one, which makes absolutely no sense, with the 4x8GB configuration being 9% faster at 1080p and 5% faster at 1440p, which is actually quite decent. Gladly, Counter-Strike 2 puts the odd results away and delivers us constant ones, as constant as the number of cheaters in every match. Now, the higher number of sticks, the higher the performance it seems, with even 2x16GB being slightly faster in the averages compared to the 1x32GB, but most importantly in the 1% lows. And of course, you can increase those values in case you're using 4x8GB, which will increase the 1% lows, especially at 4K. Hogwarts Legacy is another CPU and RAM intensive game, especially in Hogsmeade. I've tested this game hundreds of times and I'm not exaggerating, and it seems that it was made with 1440p in mind or something, as the first gains or drops in this game are always seen at 1440p, being it a GPU, CPU or RAM benchmark. As for the results, the 4x8GB configuration is the fastest one overall, delivering around the same performance as 2x16GB at 1080p and 4K, but being considerably faster at 1440p, where it was 5% faster on average, but 11% faster in the 1% lows. And the number gets even bigger if you compare the 1% lows with 1x32GB, now being 24% faster. With Dragon's Dogma 2 we're using ray tracing, so in most situations we're kind of GPU bottlenecked, at least, well, in this scenario. But we do have the 2x16GB constantly performing slightly above the other two, which is expected in some cases, but with the 4x8GB configuration actually performing worse than the 1x32GB one, which is something only seen with PCMARK 10, and now it seems it happened again. Banishers Ghosts of New Eden uses Unreal Engine 5 and is usually a GPU-intensive title, but as soon as you move into the village areas... At 1080p we had the 2x16GB being only 4% faster than the 1x32GB configuration, with the difference being even smaller when going to 4x8GB. This in terms of averages, because the 1% lows get increased by 4%. And remember that the closer the 1% lows are to the averages, the smoother the gameplay will be. As for Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, the game uses ray tracing as well, but it is not in fact a very CPU or RAM dependent game, as even at 1080p and over 140 FPS, the difference we had from 1x32GB to 4x8GB can be considered kind of margin of error, meaning that the results are virtually the same here. Starfield is the most recent poster boy from Bethesda, and like something from Bethesda, it had to deliver weird results here and there, and this is one of those cases. What a shocker! At 1080p and 1440p, the 4x8GB configuration is only slightly faster than the 1x32GB one, which is odd to begin with, but quite understandable. What is not understandable is the fact that 2x16GB one is delivering the best results here. Not by a huge difference, but it is there. At 4K we can see once again why dual channel is a must, as even the 32GB kit, or in this case the configuration, suffers here, with both kits delivering around 17% higher 1% lows. And that means the game was smoother with those configurations. The Last of Us also delivered some odd results here and there, but overall stable and understandable. At 1080p we had a 1% lows drop with a 2x16GB configuration that was most likely an occasional stutter, but the averages are on par for both kits, being 9% faster than the 1x32GB configuration. And the same exact thing applies to 1440p, which is great. But at 4K we had once again an odd result with a 2x16GB that delivers lower FPS. So I guess that in some specific instances, this game might deliver some inconsistent results, but overall trustable. And since I only use these results for one video, this one, I also tested PUBG here. And if you're looking to play this game at 200 FPS or less, you're completely fine with any configuration. You'll be having lower 1% lows with the 1x32GB one, of course, but if you want to play at over 300 FPS, then the RAM configurations will play their role, and having 2x16GB over 1x32GB will deliver you 4% more performance on average and 12% more performance in the 1% lows. Values that can get much higher with the 4x8GB configuration, that delivers 13% higher 1% lows than 2x16GB and 27% higher than 1x32GB, which is a huge difference in my book. Moving to Fortnite, we are much more GPU bottlenecked as I'm using Epic settings, Nanite and Lumen, but this just means that anything below the 140 FPS mark, with a CPU more or less like the 7500F overclocked, which is more or less like the 7600X, the difference in between RAM configurations will be very small. Spider-Man Remastered is also a game that is known to love CPU and RAM, and we can see that at 1080p and 1440p we're CPU bottlenecked, as we have basically the same FPS numbers. The only configuration performing consistently worse here, especially in the 1% lows, is the 1x32GB one, that delivers slightly lower averages but much lower 1% lows across the board, meaning it will deliver kind of a more stuttery gameplay. And to finalize, we have Resident Evil 4 using ray tracing. That is a fairly GPU intensive title, and even here we could see the 1x32GB configuration performing slightly worse in both averages and 1% lows at 1080p and 1440p. At 4K, well, you see those odd 1% lows values, but those can be due to gameplay inconsistencies or something that happened in the background while testing. Unlikely, of course, but possible. And to finalize, we have the 13 games averages, where we can get a cleaner view of the results. And in case you were worried about losing much performance with only one stick of RAM, the difference just isn't there anymore, especially with DDR5 and a 32GB stick that will be dual rank as well. The best configuration here is 4.4% faster at 1080p, 3.8% faster at 1440p, and 1% faster at 4K, where we are GPU bottlenecked, meaning that most people won't even notice any difference at all. And in case you have a single stick of 16GB, well, things are a bit different there, as you have way less RAM and single rank as well, because it is a 16GB stick, meaning the performance differences from going to, let's say, 1x16GB to 2x16GB will be higher, due to single versus dual channel, and so on. But well, that's for another video, I guess. Let's move to the final thoughts. And well guys, you saw the results. Well, we had indeed some odd results here and there, especially with the 4x8GB configuration. First of all, we have the differences in between single channel and dual channel, and that's usually why the 32GB stick is slower. Not because of the frequency and timings, because they are exactly the same, but because we are running single channel compared to the other configurations of 2x16GB and 4x8GB. It's still dual channel for the other two, because once again the CPU only supports dual channel. And it would be even worse if you, instead of having a 1x32GB, we had like 1x16GB, it would be even worse in terms of performance, because then you would have one channel only, so single channel and single rank, which would be even worse. So you would have only 16GB, which nowadays is not enough for some games. On top of that, you would have single channel that only has like half the bandwidth of dual channel, and then on top of those two you would have single rank, which would be even worse. It would be like the icing of the cake. Don't get a single stick of 16GB, it won't go well in most scenarios and you'll be most likely RAM bottlenecked. 1x32GB, as you saw, it is quite okay because we have dual rank and we have 32GB, and of course on top of that, since DDR5 changed things quite a lot, they kind of have more efficiency in terms of banks and so on. So the bank interleaving difference is not as big. Now, what's the pros and cons? As you saw in the results, the 4x8GB configuration usually, and I say usually because not all times, usually it delivered better performance than the 2x16GB and considerably better performance than the 1x32GB. And that happens once again because the bank interleaving, and even though the 8GB sticks are kind of half rank, they still perform better due to that bank interleaving, because the system can manage things better because it has more banks separated, in this case 2 sticks per channel, and so on, so on, so on. Let's not complicate that. But the cons of this configuration, or at least the main con of this configuration, is that you can't overclock as much, especially because motherboards nowadays have use daisy chain topology, which means that they favor the first 2 slots, or the main slots, which are usually the second and the fourth one, which is A2 and B2. And since that happens, the other 2 slots won't have as much signal integrity and won't be able to overclock as much. So if you're using 4 RAM sticks, the other 2 slots won't actually be able to handle the same frequencies as the first ones, and you won't be able to overclock as much as you would with a T topology motherboard, or in this case, if you were using, let's say, 2x16GB or even 2x32GB, because even though you're using dual rank, it is slightly easier than using the other slots, because once again the other slots don't have the same signal integrity. That's how the motherboards are made nowadays. So concluding, with 4 sticks you usually have higher performance That's a given if you're running at the same frequency and same timings as the other configurations. But with the other configurations, especially the 2x16GB, for example, you'll usually be able to overclock things further, especially in terms of frequency, since you're only running single rank and 2 sticks, so 1 rank per channel, and it will be much easier on the CPU's IMC, integrated memory controller, and much easier on the motherboard as well, because you're using the main slots, which will, well, basically will allow higher overclocking that will most likely give better results than the 4 sticks. So it depends, it actually depends, but overall, once again, at same frequency, same timings, 4 sticks are better, but you won't be able to overclock or tweak your RAM as much. And with DDR5, even the single channel configuration with 1x32GB performed quite well in most scenarios, and you can, for example, use 1x32GB and later get another stick of 32GB with the same frequency and timings and just run it 2x32GB, and usually the IMC will be able to handle it. Maybe not at really high frequencies, but it will handle it. Or just get, for example, 2x16GB and you're just good to go, and you still have 2 slots left if you later really want to upgrade to, let's say, 64GB and you have 4x16GB, especially since the newer Ryzen 9000 series, or if you have an Intel CPU, you'll be able to kind of overclock further. Even the APUs from Ryzen can do that now. You have to decouple the UCLK, but it's, or the mem clock, yes, the mem clock, no, the UCLK, but it will be completely fine. You can do it, so there's no issues there. My opinion as of now is just get 2x16GB, or if you really need that capacity, get 2x32GB. Don't go for the 4 sticks route, as it will be much harder on the IMC, and you might have problems. You might not even be able to achieve the expo frequency, and it will be a pain in the ass. So just go with 2 sticks, preferably if you want to go cheaper, and more than enough, 2x16GB as you saw. And well guys, that's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe and share this video. Leave your comment in the comment section and let me know what you think about these configurations and what configurations are you using on which CPU and system. Which motherboard, which CPU, how much frequency can you get with 2 or 4 sticks, the differences. Just let us know your experience. Thank you very much, and if you can, really share the video because it means a lot for me and the channel. See you in the next one, guys.